August 1944. Fog over Hyannis Port. A telegram is about to shatter a dynasty. I'm Maya, and I'm standing in front of sealed archival boxes that most people will never see. Inside these files is evidence that America's most famous political family built their empire not on solid ground, but on tragedies deliberately hidden from history. The photographs you're looking at aren't from a travel magazine. They're from restricted FBI files, estate inventories, and servant payroll records that the Kennedy family never meant to become public. For 70 years, the world saw Camelot, sunlit estates, perfect children, the myth of American royalty. But architecture doesn't lie. The estates I'm about to show you aren't monuments to success. They're crime scenes. Each room, each hidden wing, each architectural choice is evidence of what happens when ambition becomes pathology. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, where we don't just admire beauty but examine the moral cost behind it, please like and subscribe. This channel exists because you want the truth that tour guides won't tell you. Today, we're conducting a moral audit. 3 estates: Hyannis Port, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill. Most documentaries will show you the chandeliers and the poolside parties. We're going to show you the servant quarters, the wages, the swollen hands, the rooms where daughters were erased and sons were sacrificed to maintain an image. Because here's what they don't tell you about dynasties. Every perfect photograph required an invisible machine. Every smile at a state dinner was built on someone else's 15-hour workday. Every architectural marvel you admire was paid for not just in dollars, but in people. The Kennedy estates aren't cursed. They're confessions. Built by a man who could never escape his insecurities, no matter how many properties he acquired. Maintained by a woman whose obsession with perfection destroyed the daughter who couldn't measure up. Inhabited by children who learned that family loyalty meant keeping secrets that would eventually kill them. And all of it is written in the architecture. The locked rooms at Hyannis Port that held Rosemary before she disappeared. The underground tunnels at Palm Beach, where deals were made that would shape American politics. The chaotic sprawl of Hickory Hill, where Bobby Kennedy tried to build something different and failed. These aren't estates, they're diagnostic tools. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand how 3 pieces of property became monuments to the single most American tragedy. The belief that enough control, enough money, enough power can make you untouchable. It can't. Let's open the files. The first box I open is labeled Hyannis Port Acquisition, 1928. Inside is a photograph of a modest clapboard estate on the Massachusetts coast. It doesn't look like the birthplace of American royalty, but that's exactly why Joe Kennedy bought it. Maya pulls the photograph from the file and holds it to the light. The year written on the back is 1928. The location, Hyannis Port, Massachusetts. What she's looking at isn't a mansion. It's 3 white clapboard houses on 6 acres of waterfront. Modest, almost. Classical New England architecture. Green shutters. Wide porches. The kind of estate that whispers old money. Except, these houses were brand new, and the man who bought them was as far from old money as you could get in 1920s America. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Irish Catholic, son of a Boston saloon keeper, a man who'd made millions through stock manipulation, Hollywood film production, and methods that would later require congressional investigation. By 1928, at 40 years old, Kennedy had wealth. But in WASP America, wealth wasn't enough. You needed the right bloodline, the right religion, the right address. Cape Cod was where Protestant aristocracy summered. Families named Lodge, Saltonstall, Cabot. Generational fortunes. Inherited estates. A closed circle that had no intention of opening. Kennedy didn't wait for an invitation. Maya spreads out the property deed across the table. The purchase price is listed, $25,000, roughly $800,000 in today's money. For 6 waterfront acres and 3 buildings, that was strategic underbuying. Kennedy had found a seller who needed cash during uncertain economic times. But look at what he actually purchased. Not one house, 3. The main residence where he and his wife Rose would live, and 2 smaller houses flanking it on the same property. This wasn't a summer home. This was infrastructure for a dynasty. Joe Kennedy understood something that most wealthy parents didn't. Geographic proximity equals influence. If his sons grew up at the compound and then stayed at the compound after marriage, living in those smaller houses, he would maintain control. Every political decision, every business deal, every family crisis, it would all happen here within his line of sight. The architecture reflected this philosophy. Maya opens another document, a floor plan from the original construction. The main house wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for function. Joe's study positioned with a direct view of both smaller houses. He could see who came and went. A formal dining room large enough for the entire extended family, because Kennedys ate together. Daily. Mandatory attendance. Bedrooms sized to be shared, not spacious. 9 children would sleep 2 or 3 to a room, learning early that privacy was a privilege you had to earn. And at the center of everything, the waterfront. Private dock, private beach, access to Nantucket Sound. This is where Joe's real vision would be executed. Most people see a beach and think relaxation. Kennedy saw a laboratory for manufacturing winners. Swimming races, sailing competitions, touch football games on the lawn that weren't casual play, they were psychological warfare. Children keeping score. Joe watching, evaluating, deciding who showed promise and who needed to be pushed harder. Rose Kennedy managed the logistics. And Maya has found her records. There's a ledger in the archive labeled Household Management, Hyannis Port, 1929 to 1932. Rose kept meticulous notes, not just on the staff, which we'll examine later, but on her children. Joseph Jr., natural leader, requires structured competition. John, physically weaker, needs to compensate through strategy. Rosemary, this entry is different. Requires additional supervision. Keep activities structured. Even at 10 years old, Rosemary was already being flagged as someone who didn't fit the pattern, someone who would need to be managed differently. But in 1928, when Joe first purchased the compound, those problems were invisible. He stood on the porch of his new property and saw exactly what he wanted to see, a foundation. The neighbors saw something else. There are letters in the local historical society, and Maya has requested copies. WASP residents writing to each other, expressing what they called concerns about the Kennedy acquisition. One letter, dated September 1928, is particularly revealing. The new residents are loud, Catholic, and appear to have no understanding of how summer communities function. Their children race boats aggressively and show no regard for established protocols. Translation: you're not welcome here. Kennedy's response was perfect. He ignored them completely. He didn't try to fit in. He didn't apologize for his children's competitiveness or his own ambition. He simply bought the property, moved in, and started building exactly what he intended to build. A training ground. Not a home. A production facility for creating senators, possibly presidents, definitely a family that would dominate American politics for the next half-century. But here's what the architecture reveals that Kennedy himself couldn't have known in 1928. Buildings designed for total control tend to produce either perfect obedience or complete rebellion. There's rarely middle ground. The compound would create political careers. John would become president. Bobby would become attorney general. Ted would serve in the Senate for 47 years. But it would also create casualties. Rosemary, who couldn't keep up with the competition. Kathleen, who would choose love over family approval. Joe Jr., who would volunteer for a mission so dangerous it was essentially suicide, trying to live up to expectations that couldn't be met. The same pressure that forged political success would also forge the tragedies that people would later call a curse, and all of it is written in the architecture. 3 houses arranged to maintain patriarchal control, shared bedrooms designed to eliminate privacy and encourage sibling competition, a waterfront that functioned as a constant testing ground. This wasn't a summer retreat. It was a machine, and Joe Kennedy was about to turn it on. But first, he needed the second component of his empire. Because Cape Cod was perfect for summers, but wealthy families also needed a winter headquarters. Somewhere warm, somewhere glamorous, somewhere he could make the kind of private deals that would fund his children's political campaigns. He was already looking at Florida. Maya closes the Hyannis Port file and reaches for the next box. The label reads, Palm Beach Acquisition, 1933. Inside is a photograph of a Mediterranean Revival mansion, far more opulent than the Cape Cod compound. This property wasn't about fitting in with Protestant aristocracy. This was about building a second throne. Maya opens a file that most Kennedy biographies skip over entirely. It's labeled Household Staff Hyannis Port, 1934 to 1938. Inside are payroll records, employment contracts, Rose Kennedy's personal notes on servant performance. This is the part of the story that tour guides don't tell you, because understanding Camelot requires understanding the machinery that made Camelot possible. 9 children, 3 houses, 6 acres requiring constant maintenance, a public image of effortless perfection. None of it was effortless. Rose Kennedy managed the compound like a military operation, which makes sense because she was essentially running 2 institutions simultaneously. One was training future politicians. The other was maintaining a staff of 20 people whose entire job was to remain invisible. Maya spreads the payroll ledger across the table. The names are right here. Margaret O'Brien, head housekeeper, 48 years old in 1935. Salary, $18 per week, roughly $450 in today's money. Hours, 6 days per week, 14 hours per day during summer season when all 9 children were in residence. That's 84 hours a week maintaining a household where perfection was mandatory and mistakes were termination-level events. The contract specifies her responsibilities: supervising cleaning staff, managing linens for 11 family members plus guests, coordinating meal service, maintaining appearance standards throughout all 3 houses. Margaret's hands, according to a medical record Maya found cross-referenced in the same archive, showed chronic joint inflammation by age 49. Years of scrubbing floors, washing windows, managing heavy linens in an era before modern appliances. Rose's notation next to Margaret's name: satisfactory, maintain standards without supervision. Translation: invisible enough to keep. Next on the payroll, Thomas Sullivan, groundskeeper and chauffeur, age 52 in 1935. Salary, $22 per week, roughly $550 today. His responsibilities included maintaining 6 acres of lawn, gardens, and waterfront property, driving family members to church and social events, maintaining the dock and boats, and being available essentially whenever Joe Kennedy needed a car, which could be any time of day or night. Rose's note: reliable, discreet regarding family matters. That last phrase is significant. Discretion was the most valuable commodity in a Kennedy employee. You saw things, you heard things, you never repeated things. The cook, Mary Fitzgerald, no relation to Rose's maiden name despite the coincidence. Age 45. Salary, $20 per week. Responsibilities: 3 meals daily for a minimum of 11 people, often 15 or 20, when Joe brought business associates or political figures to the compound. Think about that logistics problem. You're preparing breakfast for 9 children with different age-appropriate diets. Joe wants specific foods. Rose has dietary rules. Guests require impressive presentation. And you're doing this every day, all summer, with 1930s kitchen technology. Maya found a grocery ledger from July 1936. In 1 week, the compound consumed 48 quarts of milk, 35 pounds of meat, 60 eggs, 28 loaves of bread. Mary Fitzgerald was purchasing, storing, preparing, and serving industrial quantities of food, while maintaining the illusion that meals simply appeared. Her notation from Rose, competent, occasionally requires reminders about portion control. Then there's the staff you didn't see at all. 2 laundresses working in the basement. Their names aren't on the main payroll, which suggests they were paid separately, probably less. Their job was washing sheets, towels, and clothing for 11 people, generating laundry at a rate that would break modern washing machines. 3 groundskeepers, in addition to Sullivan, maintaining the competitive sports infrastructure. The touch football lawn had to be perfect. The dock had to be safe. The boats had to be competition-ready. 1 maintenance engineer, hired seasonally, whose entire job was keeping the mechanical systems running. And here's where the architecture reveals the scale of this operation. Maya has a basement floor plan from the original construction documents. Deep under the main house, boiler rooms, water heating system sized for institutional use, not residential. Coal storage when the compound first opened, later converted to oil. The heating infrastructure alone required daily maintenance during shoulder seasons. Separate servants, quarters attached to the main house but accessed through a different entrance. 6 small bedrooms. Shared bathroom, no view of the water. The physical separation was architectural. The family lived in spaces designed for light, air, view. The staff lived in spaces designed for efficiency and invisibility. Now let's talk about what this actually cost. Total annual payroll for household staff at Hyannis Port, based on Maya's calculation from the 1936 records, approximately $5,000, roughly $125,000 in today's money. For context, Joe Kennedy's stock portfolio in 1936 was worth an estimated $4 million, roughly $95 million today. He was spending slightly more than 0.1% of his net worth to employ the people who made his entire public image possible. The return on investment was extraordinary. 20 servants working 84-hour weeks created the appearance of effortless aristocracy, perfectly maintained grounds, spotless houses, meals that appeared without visible effort, children who always looked camera-ready because someone was doing their laundry daily. This is the invisible machine that made Camelot possible. But here's what the architecture and the payroll records reveal together. The same pressure Joe applied to his children, Rose applied to the staff. Margaret O'Brien's performance reviews, written in Rose's precise handwriting, document inspection failures. Dust on the second-floor banister. Unacceptable. Guest bathroom sink shows water spots. Must improve. These weren't suggestions. Rose could terminate anyone who failed to maintain standards. The notes also reveal something darker. Next to Rosemary Kennedy's name in a household management document from 1937, Rose wrote, "Requires dedicated supervision. Staff instructed to report any concerning behavior immediately." Even at 19, Rosemary was being monitored not just by her mother, but by servants who'd been instructed to watch her and report back. The compound's competitive atmosphere wasn't just for the children. The staff competed too, for job security, for Rose's rare approval, for the privilege of working for a family that was starting to matter politically. And all of it was documented in ledgers that Maya is now reading 70 years later. The children grew up seeing this, by the way. They watched servants work 14-hour days. They saw their mother inspect rooms with white-glove precision. They learned that some people exist to serve, and other people exist to be served. Joe Jr., being groomed for the presidency, never questioned this arrangement. John, the second son, was reportedly kinder to staff, but still accepted the hierarchy as natural. The daughters, especially Kathleen, sometimes befriended younger servants, but understood the boundaries. And Rosemary, who struggled to understand so many things, understood this. She was being watched, always, by family and by people paid to report her failures. The machine that Joe built at Hyannis Port had 2 products. One was political careers, future senators, a future president. The other was casualties. And the first casualty would be the daughter who couldn't keep up. But before that tragedy, Joe needed to expand his empire. Because summer in Massachusetts was perfect for training children, but a dynasty also needed a winter headquarters. Somewhere warm, somewhere he could make the kind of private deals that built political careers. He'd found the location, Palm Beach, Florida, and the house he bought there would reveal even more about his priorities. Maya closes the Hyannis Port payroll ledger and reaches for the Palm Beach acquisition file. The photograph inside shows a Mediterranean Revival mansion that looks nothing like the Cape Cod compound. This property wasn't about training. It was about projection. And the architectural details reveal exactly what Joe Kennedy wanted the world to see. Maya opens the Palm Beach file and immediately notices the difference. Where Hyannis Port's documents were about function and control, these blueprints are about performance. The estate Joe Kennedy purchased in 1933 was called La Guarida. The name means the den, or the lair in Spanish. Perfect, really, for what it would become. The timing was strategic. America was drowning in the Great Depression, unemployment at 25%, breadlines stretching around blocks. Palm Beach estates that had cost millions in the 1920s were being liquidated for fractions of their value. Joe Kennedy, who'd pulled his money from the market before the crash, was shopping for bargains while families lost everything. The purchase price Maya finds in the deed, $120,000, roughly $2.8 million in today's money. The original owner had paid 3 times that in 1928. Someone's desperation became Joe's winter palace. But here's where the architecture reveals his true priorities. Maya spreads the original construction specifications across the table, and the level of detail is extraordinary. This wasn't the understated clapboard of Cape Cod. This was Mediterranean Revival at its most elaborate. And every material choice was calculated to signal wealth, sophistication, and access to resources most Americans couldn't even imagine. Start with the ceilings. The library ceiling wasn't painted plaster or simple wood. The specification reads, carved ebony panels, 64 square meters total coverage, sourced from African Diospyros species, installation by imported Swiss master craftsmen. Maya has found the contractor invoices. The Swiss woodworkers were brought to Palm Beach specifically for this project. 3 master carvers, 8 weeks of work, hand-chiseling geometric patterns into ebony panels that would have been worth a small fortune even before the labor costs. The invoice total for just the library ceiling, $18,000 in 1933 money, roughly $420,000 today. For one-room ceiling. Think about what that represents. While families were losing homes, Joe Kennedy was paying nearly $500,000 in modern dollars to have Swiss craftsmen carve African hardwood into decorative panels that most visitors would barely notice. Now the marble work. The main entrance hall specifications list, quote, Carrara marble, first-grade statuario quality, hand-selected from Michelangelo quarries, Tuscany. 12mm tiles with hand-carved border details. Maya has photographs of these tiles. The marble isn't just white. It has the distinctive gold veining that marks the highest-grade Carrara, the same stone used in Renaissance sculptures. The border tiles feature individually carved acanthus leaf patterns, no two identical, each one hand-chiseled by Italian stonemasons whose names appear on the shipping manifests Maya found cross-referenced in Port of Palm Beach customs records. Cost for the entrance hall marble alone, $22,000, roughly $515,000 today. If you were to run your hand across these tiles now, you'd feel the slight variations where human hands carved each leaf. The marble is cool, smooth, but not machine-perfect. You can detect the tool marks if you know what you're looking for. That imperfection is what made it expensive. Mass production was available even in 1933. Joe chose hand-carved because it signaled that cost was irrelevant. The floor plans reveal something else about this property's purpose. Unlike Hyannis Port's open, visible layout, Palm Beach was designed with zones of privacy that could be sealed off from the main house. Maya has the architectural drawing spread out, and the configuration is revealing. The main social areas, entrance hall, formal dining room, drawing room. These were performance spaces designed to impress guests with soaring ceilings, expensive materials, perfect proportions. But behind the formal zones, a network of smaller rooms, studies, private offices with separate exterior access, Joe could meet with people who never entered the main house. Business associates could arrive, conduct meetings in these private spaces, and leave without encountering family or other guests. The basement level is even more interesting. The original plans show wine storage, mechanical rooms, standard service areas. But there's also a private study with reinforced walls and a separate telephone line installation noted in the electrical specifications. This wasn't about wine. This was about communications Joe wanted completely private. The servants' quarters at Palm Beach were larger than Hyannis Port's because the staff requirements were different. Where Cape Cod needed people who could manage children and athletic equipment, Palm Beach needed people who understood formal service. The specifications list separate quarters for head butler, personal maids for Rose and the daughters, chef, sous chef, housekeeping staff, groundskeepers, and one position that's particularly telling: social secretary with private office and telephone access. That wasn't a servant. That was someone managing Joe's network. Maya found a Palm Beach staff payroll from 1936. Total annual cost, $12,000, roughly $280,000 today. Nearly double the Hyannis Port payroll, but for a property used only seasonally. The gardens reveal another layer of expense. The landscape plan specifies imported royal palms, minimum 15 meters height, mature specimens only. Bougainvillea cultivated in greenhouse until established. Italian stone fountains with recirculating systems. Those mature royal palms cost between $500 and $1,000 each in 1933 money. The landscape plan called for 18 of them. Joe was creating an environment that looked effortlessly elegant, while spending the equivalent of millions on elements most visitors would assume had always been there. But here's what the architecture and materials reveal about Joe's psychology. Palm Beach wasn't about family. It was about projection. Hyannis Port was where he shaped his children. Palm Beach was where he displayed the results. The formal dining room could seat 30. The proportions were designed to make even large gatherings feel intimate, which required precise architectural calculation. High ceilings would make the room feel cold. Low ceilings would make it feel cramped. The architects threaded that needle at exactly 4.2 meters, as specified in the drawings. When Joe hosted political figures, industrialists, or foreign dignitaries at that dining table, surrounded by hand-carved ebony and Carrara marble, the message was clear. This isn't new money trying too hard. This is established wealth with access to the finest materials and craftsmen in the world. It was theater, expensive, meticulously designed theater. And it worked. By the late 1930s, Joe was appointed ambassador to Britain, an Irish Catholic representing America at the court of St. James, the ultimate validation of his forced entry into WASP America's elite circles. The ambassadorship didn't last. Joe's statements about accommodation with certain European political movements made him toxic. He resigned in 1940. Reputation damaged, political career finished. But the Palm Beach estate remained, a place to retreat, a place to plan, a place where he could shift all his frustrated ambitions onto his sons. The property that was supposed to showcase his own power became the headquarters for building theirs. And all of it built on someone else's Depression-era desperation, furnished with materials that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, designed to hide as much as it revealed. The underground study, the private telephone lines, the separate access points. Palm Beach wasn't just a winter palace. It was a fortress for conducting business that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Maya closes the Palm Beach architectural specifications and reaches for a file marked Medical Records, Confidential, 1941. Inside is documentation of a decision that would haunt the Kennedy family for generations. The daughter who couldn't keep up with the competition was about to disappear. Maya hesitates before opening this file. The label reads, Medical Records RMK Confidential, 1941. Inside is documentation that the Kennedy family kept hidden for decades. Hospital intake forms. Surgical consent, signed only by Joseph Kennedy. Post-operative reports that use clinical language to describe a catastrophe. Rosemary Marie Kennedy, born September 13, 1918, third child, eldest daughter. The early photographs show a beautiful child, smiling, playing with her siblings on the Hyannis Port lawn. But the files Maya has already examined told a different story. Rose's household management notes from 1929. Rosemary, age 11, requires additional supervision. Reading level remains elementary. Physical coordination weak. By 1935, social situations difficult. Needs coaching on appropriate responses. Struggles to follow dinner conversations. By 1938, mood swings reported by staff. Frustration when unable to complete tasks. Recommend continued monitoring. That word again. Monitoring, watching, reporting. In a family where competition was everything, where you had to be quick or be dismissed, Rosemary fell behind from the beginning. The exact nature of her disability was never formally diagnosed. Modern medical analysis suggests intellectual developmental disorder, possibly caused by oxygen deprivation during a difficult birth. Her IQ was estimated around 70. She could read and write at an elementary level. She could hold simple conversations. But complex reasoning, rapid debate, strategic thinking, all the things her siblings excelled at, were beyond her reach. Joe and Rose tried everything. Special schools, private tutors. They hoped she'd catch up, that with enough money and effort, the gap would close. It didn't. By her early 20s, new concerns emerged. Rosemary was a beautiful young woman. She attended social events. She was interested in young men. And Joe Kennedy, who had built his dynasty on total control, saw a problem he couldn't manage. In his mind, her intellectual limitations made her vulnerable, unable to make sound judgments, at risk of exploitation or pregnancy. There's also evidence that her behavior was becoming harder to control. Mood swings, frustration that could turn aggressive when she couldn't do what her siblings did effortlessly. Whether these concerns were genuine or exaggerated to justify what came next, historians still debate. In 1941, Joe heard about a new procedure, lobotomy, being promoted by some physicians as a treatment for behavioral and intellectual issues. It involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe. The procedure was experimental. The risks were enormous. The success rate was unclear. But Joe convinced himself it might help, or make Rosemary easier to manage, or solve the problem of a daughter who didn't fit the perfect family image he was building. Maya finds the consent form. Signed November 1941. Only one signature, Joseph P. Kennedy. Rose's name doesn't appear anywhere on the surgical authorization. Most historians believe Joe didn't tell Rose what was actually involved. Some say he told her nothing. Others say he minimized the risks. Either way, Rose wasn't present for the decision or the surgery. November 1941. George Washington University Hospital. Rosemary Kennedy, age 23, underwent the procedure. The surgical notes are clinical, but the details are horrifying. The doctors kept her awake. They asked her to recite prayers and sing songs. When she could no longer respond coherently, they knew they'd cut enough. The operation was a catastrophe. The post-operative assessment, filed 3 weeks later, uses careful medical language. Patient exhibits severe cognitive impairment. Motor function significantly reduced. Speech capability minimal. Requires full-time institutional care. Translation: Rosemary emerged with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She could barely walk. Her speech was largely gone. She was incontinent. The daughter who had struggled but maintained independence was now completely incapacitated. Joe immediately moved her out of sight. First to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York. Then in 1949 to St. Coletta School in Wisconsin, a Catholic institution for people with developmental disabilities. Rosemary would never return to Hyannis Port or Palm Beach. The family was told she was teaching mentally challenged children at a school in Wisconsin. That was the official story. Many of the younger Kennedy children believed it for years. They were discouraged from visiting. Joe said it would upset Rosemary to see family and then have them leave. Rose eventually learned the truth. Her reaction isn't fully documented, but she was reportedly devastated. Her daughter had been permanently damaged by a procedure Rose hadn't understood or approved. But in the Kennedy family, you didn't contradict Joe. At Hyannis Port, Rosemary's bedroom remained. Same furniture, same position in the house she'd occupied before. But she was gone. Her siblings were told not to discuss her. The family presented a united front to the public. Everyone successful, accomplished, perfect. Rosemary didn't fit that image anymore, so she was erased. Maya has found architectural drawings from a 1943 renovation at Hyannis Port. The floor plans show Rosemary's room marked as storage now, not a bedroom, storage. The physical space remained. The person was simply removed from the record. This is what the architecture reveals about the Kennedy family's pathology. When something didn't fit Joe's vision, it wasn't reformed or accommodated. It was eliminated, and the space it occupied was repurposed as if it had never been lived in. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta for the next 64 years. The Kennedy family paid for her care, but visits were rare. Joe never saw her again after sending her there. He couldn't face what he'd done. Rose eventually visited, but infrequently. The younger siblings weren't allowed to see her until they were adults and could make their own decisions. The secret was kept until the 1960s. The public didn't know Rosemary had been institutionalized or why. The family maintained the fiction of her teaching in Wisconsin. Only when the family's profile became so high that investigations became inevitable did fragments of truth start to emerge. Years later, some of the siblings expressed guilt. Kathleen especially felt she'd failed to protect her sister. But in 1941, the family pattern was established: loyalty to Joe's vision above everything else, even above protecting one of their own. Rosemary's treatment reflected both medical ignorance of that era and Joe Kennedy's ruthless approach to problems. Lobotomy was seen as progressive by some doctors, but Joe's decision to pursue it without Rose's full knowledge and his willingness to hide Rosemary away permanently when it failed showed how far he'd go to maintain the perfect family image. The two estates had been built as stages for Kennedy's success. Rosemary's story showed what happened when a Kennedy didn't fit the success narrative. You were removed, hidden. Your room stood empty while the family moved on. The empty bedroom at Hyannis Port became a kind of monument, not to Rosemary herself, but to the cost of Joe's ambition, a physical space that remained while the person who'd occupied it was erased from family history. Architecture doesn't just reveal what people build, it reveals what they're willing to sacrifice. And Rosemary Kennedy was the first sacrifice for the dynasty Joe was building. She wouldn't be the last. Rosemary Kennedy lived until 2005, 64 years institutionalized because of a procedure that was supposed to help her. Her siblings, when they finally learned the full truth, were horrified. Some became advocates for people with intellectual disabilities, perhaps trying to atone. But the damage was done. The empty room remained, and the family learned a terrible lesson. If you don't fit the image, you disappear. That lesson would echo through every tragedy that followed. Maya closes the medical file and reaches for the next document. It's a Western Union telegram. Date, August 13, 1944. Destination, Kennedy Compound, Hyannis Port. The message is brief, but it would shatter Joe's carefully constructed dynasty in ways even Rosemary's tragedy hadn't. The telegram announces the death of Joseph Kennedy, Jr., the heir. The son, everything had been built around, and the pressure that had pushed him to volunteer for a mission so dangerous it was essentially suicide would now transfer to the brother who'd always been second. The architecture of control Joe had created at Hyannis Port was about to claim its second victim. Maya reads the telegram text from the Western Union archive copy. Date, August 13, 1944. Destination, Joseph P. Kennedy, Hyannis Port, Massachusetts. The message is 23 words. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., is missing in action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country. Missing in action. The military's careful phrasing for deaths too catastrophic to confirm with bodies. Joe Sr. received it alone in the main house at Hyannis Port. Rose was at church. When she returned, he told her, their firstborn son, the one they'd invested everything in, the future senator, the future president, gone. The war had been inevitable after Pearl Harbor. All the Kennedy sons of fighting age enlisted. Joe Jr. joined the Navy, trained as a pilot. John commanded a PT boat in the Pacific. Even young Robert, too young for combat, prepared to serve. For Joe Jr., military service was part of the plan. His father had mapped it out: serve with distinction, return home as a hero, run for Congress, eventually the presidency. Everything proceeding according to design. Then John's story hit the newspapers. August 1943. PT-109, John's patrol torpedo boat, was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands. The boat split in half. 2 crew members died. John and the survivors swam to a small island. John towed an injured crewman for hours, the man's life jacket strap clenched in his teeth. They survived for days before rescue. The story made front pages. John Kennedy, the officer who saved his crew. Joe Sr. ensured maximum coverage. John received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. He returned home in early 1944, still recovering from injuries, but a certified war hero. Joe Jr. watched this unfold. His younger brother, the sickly one who'd always been second, now a decorated hero. Newspapers praised John. People asked Joe Jr. about his heroic brother. The competitive dynamic that had defined their childhood at Hyannis Port intensified to breaking point. Joe Jr. needed to match or exceed what John had done. He needed to be back in the spotlight where he belonged. So he volunteered for Operation Aphrodite. Maya has found the mission briefing documents in Navy archives. The operation was experimental, dangerous, possibly suicidal. The concept: load bomber planes with explosives, far more than they'd normally carry. Pilots would fly toward targets, arm the explosives, set autopilot, then parachute out before impact. The unmanned explosive-packed planes would hit German installations. The risks were obvious: mechanical failures, navigation problems, explosions before pilots could escape. But Joe Jr. saw opportunity. If the mission succeeded, he'd be the hero who took on the most dangerous assignment. It would overshadow John's PT boat story. August 12, 1944. Joe Jr. and his co-pilot took off from England in a modified bomber packed with explosives. The plan: fly toward the target, arm the explosives, set autopilot, bail out. Escort planes would guide the unmanned bomber to its destination. Something went wrong. Witnesses in the escort planes saw a massive explosion. Joe Jr.'s bomber disintegrated in mid-air over the English countryside. Both pilots died instantly. The explosion was so complete that almost nothing remained. No bodies to recover. No remains to send home. At Hyannis Port, the family was gathered for summer when the telegram arrived. Maya has found photographs taken at the compound in the days after. The flag at half-mast. Cars arriving, with visitors paying respects. The windows of Joe Jr.'s bedroom, second floor, curtains drawn. The family gathered in the main house living room. Joe sat in his chair. Rose wept. The younger children struggled to understand. John was still recovering from his own war injuries. Now he'd have to carry the burden his older brother was meant to bear. And here's where the architecture reveals the family's response to trauma. Joe Jr., bedroom at the compound, remained exactly as it was. His trophies from school, his photographs, his books, the bed made, the desk organized. The room became a shrine, Joe Sr. couldn't face closing it. For months, maybe years, the door stayed open. The room preserved exactly as Joe Jr. had left it before shipping out. This wasn't grief. This was architectural pathology. The physical space held the weight of everything Joe Sr. had invested in his firstborn son, and because that investment couldn't transfer to a bedroom, it transferred to a person. John. Maya has a letter John wrote to a friend in late 1944, now held in the Kennedy Library archives. One line is particularly revealing. "I can feel the walls of that house pressing in on me. Every room reminds me of what I'm supposed to become." The compound that had been a training ground for Joe Jr.'s political career became the same for John. But John hadn't been trained for this. He'd been the second son, the backup plan. He'd considered journalism, teaching, maybe writing. Joe Sr.'s plans didn't allow for those options. Joe Jr. was dead. Someone had to fulfill the vision. John was now that someone. The bedroom where John had always been second became the room of the heir. The weight of his father's expectations, already heavy, increased dramatically. And the preserved bedroom of his dead brother loomed over him, a constant reminder of what he had to replace. This is what the Hyannis Port compound architecture reveals about how the Kennedy family processed loss. They didn't process it, they transferred it. The competitive pressure that had pushed Joe Jr. to volunteer for a suicide mission now fell entirely on John. The same mechanism that had produced one death was being applied to the survivor. Rose coped through faith. More church, more prayers, more rosaries. She'd lost a son, and her faith told her it was God's will. Catholic stoicism became more pronounced. The younger children watched this unfold. Robert saw his older brothers, paths, one dead in war, one being pushed into politics he hadn't chosen. The Kennedy family pattern was clear. You served the dynasty's goals regardless of personal preference. Individual desires were secondary to family ambition. By late 1944, the compound felt different. The competitive energy was still there. Joe Sr. still pushed his children. But loss had entered. The first death that touched the family directly. The first time Kennedy confidence was shaken. They'd believed they could win at everything. Now they knew they couldn't. But instead of learning from that lesson, Joe Sr. doubled down. If one son was lost, the remaining son would carry twice the weight. The flag at Hyannis Port flew at half-mast for weeks. Politicians who'd expected to work with Joe Jr. someday came to pay respects. But condolences didn't change the reality. The carefully groomed heir was gone. And the architectural response to that loss, preserving Joe Jr. past room as a shrine while transferring all expectations to John's room, revealed everything about Joe Kennedy's priorities. The dynasty mattered more than the individual sons who built it. The compound's walls, designed to create winners, had created a casualty. And instead of changing the design, Joe decided the problem was that he didn't have enough sons in the machine. John would have to be enough. He'd have to carry what Joe Jr. couldn't. He'd have to become president, because that was the plan. And Kennedy plans didn't change for something as inconvenient as death. Maya finds one more document in the file, a contractor's invoice from 1946. Work performed. Installation of lock on second floor bedroom door. Client request. Room to remain sealed and preserved. Joe Jr. His bedroom was officially closed. Locked. A time capsule. But the expectations stored in that room didn't stay locked away. They poured into the compound's other bedrooms. Into John's room. Into Bobby's. Into Ted's. One son dead. 8 remaining. The machine would continue. The war ended in 1945. The Kennedys moved forward. But something had changed at the compound. The first crack in the family's armor. The beginning of understanding that the dynasty Joe had built might have costs he hadn't anticipated. Costs measured in sons who died trying to meet impossible standards. And in bedrooms that became monuments to those failures. But Joe Jr. wasn't the only child who would choose a dangerous path to escape the compound's gravitational pull. Kathleen Kennedy, called Kick, had already made her own escape. She'd chosen love over family approval, independence over dynasty, and in 1948 she would make one final choice that would end the same way her brothers had, with a telegram. And another preserved room. Maya opens a file marked Kathleen Kennedy, 1920 to 1948. Inside are letters, newspaper clippings about society weddings, and then a final Western Union telegram from May 1948. Kathleen Kennedy, called Kick by everyone, had always been different. At Hyannis Port, while her brothers competed brutally and her sisters tried to meet impossible standards, Kick found her own path. She was outgoing, charming, less intimidated by her father than her siblings. People were drawn to her warmth and humor. In a family of calculated ambition, Kick seemed genuinely happy. The war sent her to England. She worked for the Red Cross in London during the Blitz. Bombs fell nightly. Buildings collapsed. People died. But Kick thrived in the chaos. She attended parties, made connections, and met William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. William came from one of England's most prominent aristocratic families, Chatsworth House. Vast estates, centuries of lineage. He was Protestant. Kick was Catholic. The religious divide created problems immediately. Joe Kennedy saw political advantage in the match. His daughter marrying into British aristocracy would cement Kennedy legitimacy, the Irish outsider's daughter becoming English nobility, perfect. But Rose saw betrayal. Catholic doctrine was clear. Marrying outside the church was unacceptable. If Kick married a Protestant in a Protestant ceremony, she'd be committing mortal sin in Rose's eyes. Kick loved William. The religion problem seemed like something they could work around. They'd raised children Catholic, they agreed, but that wasn't enough for Rose. The ceremony itself mattered. A Protestant ceremony meant Kick would be excommunicated. The wedding happened in May 1944, a civil ceremony, not in a church. Rose refused to attend. Joe attended, seeing the political benefits. The family was divided. Kick was choosing love and independence over her mother's approval. 4 months later, William was killed in combat. A sniper in Belgium. September 1944. Kick was a widow at 24. She could have returned to America, to Hyannis Port, to family control. Instead, she stayed in England. The Cavendish family welcomed her. She was their son's widow. They gave her rooms at their estates, included her in family affairs. For the first time, Kick wasn't defined primarily as a Kennedy. She was Lady Hartington. She had her own identity, her own place in society. Rose wanted her home, back to America, back to proper Catholic life, back under family control. Kick refused. England was where she'd been happy with William, where she'd found acceptance. She'd visit America occasionally, but wouldn't move back. The years after William's death were complicated. Kick grieved, but also enjoyed her independence. She had money from the Cavendish family, social status. She moved in aristocratic circles. She was free from both her father's ambitions and her mother's religious strictures. Then she met Peter Fitzwilliam, Earl Fitzwilliam, enormously wealthy, charming, sophisticated, and married. He was separated from his wife but not divorced. Catholic doctrine made this even worse than her first marriage. Dating a married man was absolutely forbidden. Kick didn't care. She'd already broken with church teaching by marrying a Protestant. She'd chosen her own path once. She could do it again. She and Peter began a relationship that scandalized both the Cavendish family and her own. Joe Kennedy heard about the relationship and was furious, not because of Catholic morality. Joe had never been particularly religious, but because the scandal could damage the family's image. John was beginning his political career. A sister openly dating a married man could hurt him. According to multiple accounts, Joe threatened to cut Kik off financially if she continued with Peter. He demanded she end the relationship, choose family loyalty over personal happiness, return to being a proper Kennedy daughter. Kik had a different plan. Peter's divorce would eventually come through, they'd marry, she'd face whatever consequences came. She'd already lost one husband. She wasn't going to lose another man she loved because her father disapproved. In May 1948, Kik and Peter planned a trip to the south of France. They'd discuss their future, make plans, possibly announce their engagement. They chartered a small private plane to fly from Paris to Cannes. The weather was terrible. A storm system over the Rhone Valley. Their pilot advised against flying. But they had reservations. Plans. They decided to go anyway. The plane took off from Paris on May 13, 1948. The storm was worse than anticipated. The small plane struggled. Visibility was near zero. The pilot tried to navigate through the weather. Somewhere over the French Alps, probably trying to find a way through the mountains, the plane struck a peak. Everyone aboard died instantly. Kik was 28 years old. Peter was 37. They were found days later when search parties located the wreckage high in the mountains. The news reached Hyannis Port by telegram. Another telegram announcing another death. Maya has a copy. The text is brief. Deeply regret to inform you Lady Hartington killed in aircraft accident France stop. Details to follow stop. Rose received it with complicated emotions, according to letters she wrote to family friends that Maya has found in the archives. Her daughter was dead, but her daughter had also been living in what Rose considered sin with a married man. Rose's grief was mixed with a sense that this was somehow judgment for Kik's choices. Joe Sr. was devastated. Whatever anger he'd felt about Peter, Kik was still his daughter, the charming, independent child who'd brightened the compound. Gone. He'd threatened to cut her off financially. Now she was dead, and those threats were the last significant interaction they'd had. Neither Joe nor Rose attended the funeral. It was held in England in the Cavendish family plot. The official explanation was that Joe couldn't travel due to health concerns, but many believed the real reason was that attending would mean acknowledging Kik's relationship with Peter. The Kennedys wouldn't publicly validate what they'd privately condemned. The Cavendish family buried Kik with full honors. She was Lady Hartington, William's widow. That's how England remembered her. The Kennedy family's absence was noted and created awkwardness. Their daughter was being buried, and they weren't there. At Hyannis Port, Kik's absence became permanent, like Rosemary before her, though for different reasons. Rosemary had been hidden because she didn't fit the success narrative. Kik was gone because she'd chosen independence over family control. The pattern was emerging. Kennedy children who followed the script, Joe Jr. before his death, John now entering politics, were celebrated. Those who deviated were lost. Rosemary institutionalized. Kik dead after refusing to return to the family orbit. The dynasty required conformity. Rose processed Kik's death through religious framework. Her daughter had strayed from church teaching, married a Protestant, then dated a married man. The plane crash, in Rose's view, might have been divine intervention preventing worse sin. Joe Sr. couldn't intellectualize it that way. He'd lost 2 children in 4 years. Joe Jr., the heir to everything he'd built, and Kik, the daughter who'd actually seemed happy, even if she'd chosen happiness outside family plans. The cost of the dynasty was becoming clear. Maya has found a photograph of the Hyannis Port dining room from 1949. The table is set for a family gathering. The composition is striking. 2 empty chairs. Joe Jr.'s place. Kik's place. The table is smaller. The competitive energy that had defined family meals is visibly diminished in the way people are seated, the space between them. Death had entered the compound twice now. Both times it had taken children who were supposed to be part of the dynasty's future. Jean was in his early 30s, beginning his political career. He'd lost his older brother and one of his favorite sisters within 4 years. The family that had seemed invincible when he was growing up was revealing itself to be fragile. By 1948, only 7 of Joe and Rose's 9 children remained. Rosemary was alive but gone, locked away in Wisconsin. Joe Jr. and Kick were dead. The family that was supposed to conquer American politics was being diminished by forces Joe couldn't control. The curse narrative was still years away. In 1948, people just saw tragic coincidences. A war death, a plane crash. Sad, but not supernatural. But the pattern had started. Kennedy ambition meeting Kennedy loss. The dynasty requiring sacrifices its architect hadn't anticipated. Kick's rebellion had ended in French mountains. Her refusal to conform, to return to Hyannis Port, to accept family control, had led her to that plane. Whether different choices would have saved her is unknowable. But her death reinforced the family's belief that leaving the Kennedy orbit was dangerous. That independence from the dynasty led to disaster. The message was clear to the surviving children: stay close. Follow the plan. Deviation was deadly. The compound was safety. Leaving led to loss. Whether this was true or just what the family needed to believe to make sense of tragedy, it became Kennedy doctrine. 2 more empty chairs. 2 more closed bedrooms. The compound built for dynasty was becoming a museum of loss. But the dynasty couldn't stop because of loss. Joe Sr. had invested too much. John Kennedy, the reluctant heir, would have to fulfill the vision his dead brother couldn't. And Hyannis Port, the compound built to train winners, would transform into something else entirely: the summer White House. The stage where Camelot would reach its peak, and where the most famous tragedy of all would begin. John Fitzgerald Kennedy never wanted to be a politician. He'd thought about journalism. Maybe teaching. Writing interested him. His senior thesis at Harvard became a book, Why England Slept, about British appeasement before the war. He saw himself as an observer and analyst, not a participant in the arena. But Joe Jr. was dead. Someone had to fulfill Joe Sr.'s vision, and John was the only remaining option among the older sons. Robert was too young, still finishing school. It had to be John. His father made this clear. The family needed this. Joe Jr.'s death couldn't mean the end of Kennedy political ambitions. John's war injuries gave him problems. His back was damaged from the PT boat collision. He'd contracted malaria in the Pacific. He was often in pain. But the injuries also gave him a narrative. The war hero who'd saved his crew. His father ensured that story was told and retold. It became the foundation for John's political identity. In 1946, John ran for Congress from Massachusetts' 11th District. Working-class areas. Irish Catholic neighborhoods. The kind of places where Kennedy name recognition helped. The campaign was run from Hyannis Port when possible. Joe Sr. coordinated everything. Strategy sessions at the main house. Phone calls from his study. The compound became campaign headquarters. Money flowed from Joe's fortune. Nothing was left to chance. John won easily. At 29, he was Congressman Kennedy. He moved to Washington, but returned to Hyannis Port regularly. The compound remained home base, where he recharged, where he got instructions from his father, where the family gathered to plan next moves. Being a congressman wasn't enough. Joe Sr. aimed higher. Senate, then presidency. The path Joe Jr. was supposed to take, John would now follow. In 1952, John ran for Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Lodge, was an incumbent, well-established, from one of Massachusetts' most prominent old families. The kind of WASP aristocrat Joe Kennedy had spent decades trying to match. The campaign was brutal and expensive. Joe Sr. spent whatever it took. He called in every favor, used every connection. The Kennedy political machine, based from Hyannis Port, operated at full capacity. Robert, just out of law school, managed the campaign. The family was all in. John won, Senator Kennedy at age 35. The victory was significant. A Kennedy had beaten a Lodge. Irish Catholic new money had defeated Protestant old money. It validated everything Joe Sr. had worked toward. But John's personal life remained unsettled. He dated various women, society girls, actresses, nothing serious. His father wanted him married. A politician needed a wife, especially if he was aiming for the presidency. Bachelor senators raised questions about stability and character. John met Jacqueline Bouvier at a dinner party in 1951. She was 12 years younger, sophisticated, beautiful. From a wealthy background, though not as wealthy as the Kennedys. She'd been educated in Europe. She spoke French fluently. She had the polish the Kennedys sometimes lacked despite their money. They married in September 1953 in Newport, Rhode Island. Massive wedding. Over 800 guests. Jackie wore a gown with 50 yards of silk. It was a society event of the season. But Jackie's introduction to the Kennedy family dynamic was jarring. She'd grown up in a quieter, more refined environment. The Kennedy compound was chaos by comparison. Loud voices, constant competition, touch football games where she was expected to participate, political discussions where everyone talked over each other. Joe Sr. claimed one of the smaller houses on the Hyannis Port compound for John and Jackie. This was the original plan. His sons would live on the property even after marriage. John's house was steps from his parents. Privacy was limited. Jackie found this suffocating. The competitive atmosphere that John had grown up with struck Jackie as childish. Grown men keeping score in touch football games, sisters competing over who had the best outfit, political one-upmanship at dinner. Everyone constantly trying to prove they were the smartest, fastest, most accomplished Kennedy in the room. Jackie retreated when she could. She'd escape to her own family's properties. She'd find excuses to be elsewhere. The Kennedy compound, which was supposed to be Dynasty headquarters, felt to her like a pressure cooker where she couldn't breathe. But the compound served its political purpose. Photographers came to capture the young senator at home with his beautiful wife. Images of John and Jackie at Hyannis Port appeared in magazines. The sailboat. The beach. The casual elegance of summer on Cape Cod. It sold the Kennedy brand effectively. John's political career continued its rise. He wrote another book, Profiles in Courage, about senators who'd taken principled but unpopular stands. Published in 1956, it became a bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize. Questions later emerged about how much John actually wrote versus how much was written by speechwriter Ted Sorensen. But the book enhanced John's intellectual image. By the mid-1950s, the Kennedy compound was operating as it was designed to. Political strategy developed there. Family meetings, coordinated campaigns. The property's prestige added to the family's image. And John was positioned for the next step, the presidency. Joe Sr.'s health was declining. He'd turned 70 in 1958. His energy wasn't what it had been. But his ambition for his sons hadn't diminished. If anything, losing Joe Jr. made him more determined that John would reach the presidency. The dynasty couldn't end. It had to continue through the next generation. The compound also served as refuge from Washington. John's Senate work was often tedious. Committee meetings, constituent services, the day-to-day mechanics of legislation. But at Hyannis Port, he could relax somewhat, sail, swim, spend time with family. The compound represented escape from political grind even as it remained political headquarters. Jackie struggled with this duality. She wanted a private life, separate from constant Kennedy family involvement. But that wasn't how the family operated. Everything was shared. Everything was discussed. Privacy was viewed as selfishness. The family came first, always. She also struggled with the compound's casual approach to infidelity. Joe Sr. had affairs throughout his marriage to Rose. This was known and tolerated within the family. John followed his father's pattern. He had relationships with various women even after marriage. At the compound, This was accepted as normal behavior for Kennedy men. Jackie knew, everyone knew. But the family expectation was that you didn't make it public, you maintained appearances, you stood by your husband. That's what Rose had done, that's what Kennedy wives did. Jackie found this arrangement painful, but learned to navigate it. By 1958, John was preparing for a presidential run. The compound would be central to the campaign. Family meetings to plan strategy, photo opportunities showing the vibrant Kennedy clan. The properties, Hyannis Port and Palm Beach, would project success, youth, vigor. Everything Joe Sr. had built toward was approaching fulfillment. John's house on the compound became his operational base when he wasn't in Washington. Staff, security, communications equipment. The small house that had been part of the original compound purchase was now the home of a potential president. The transformation was complete. The property Joe bought in 1928, as an outsider forcing his way into WASP society, had become the headquarters of a political dynasty. The Irish Catholic family that wasn't supposed to belong was now producing a senator who might become president. Maya has found a photograph from 1958, Joe Sr. standing on the main house porch, looking across the compound at his children. Joe Jr. and Kick were gone. Rosemary was institutionalized. But John was a senator. Robert was becoming a skilled political operator. The younger children were developing. The dynasty was working despite the losses. The compound had witnessed death and grief, but it had also been the training ground for success. The competitive atmosphere, the constant pressure, the relentless push for achievement. It had all served its purpose. At least one Kennedy was reaching the heights Joe had envisioned. In 1958, the future looked bright. John would run for president. He'd probably win. The compound would become the summer White House. Everything was proceeding according to the revised plan. What Joe couldn't see was that the brightest moment would also mark the beginning of the darkest period. That success and tragedy were about to intertwine in ways that would haunt the compound forever. That the properties he'd built to showcase Kennedy triumph would become monuments to Kennedy loss. But in 1958, standing on his porch at Hyannis Port, Joe Kennedy believed the dynasty was secure. His son would be president. The vision was becoming reality. The compound had served its purpose. The machine he'd built 30 years ago was finally producing the result he'd designed it for. A Kennedy in the White House. But not all the Kennedy children wanted to live under Joe Sr.'s constant oversight at Hyannis Port. Robert Kennedy needed his own space, his own version of family life. And the estate he chose, Hickory Hill in Virginia, would reveal everything about the difference between Joe's vision of control and Bobby's vision of chaos. Between the regimented compound and something closer to actual family life. Robert Kennedy needed his own place. He'd managed John's Senate campaign, he'd worked in the Justice Department, he'd married Ethel Skakel in 1950. By the mid-1950s, they had several children and more coming. Living at the Hyannis Port compound, or near his parents, wasn't working anymore. In 1955, John bought an estate in McLean, Virginia, just outside Washington. Hickory Hill. A substantial property with a large house, extensive grounds, and history. It had been Civil War General George McClellan's headquarters. John thought he and Jackie would live there. Jackie visited the property and hated it. Too big, too far from Washington, too isolated. She wanted something smaller, more manageable, closer to the city, and she was pregnant, experiencing difficulties. The house felt wrong to her. She refused to live there. John sold it to Robert in 1957. Bobby and Ethel loved it immediately. The space, the privacy from Joe Sr.'s constant oversight, the possibilities. They moved in and began transforming it into something completely different from either Hyannis Port or Palm Beach. Hickory Hill became chaos by design. Ethel wanted animals, lots of them. A horse named Geronimo that would sometimes wander into the house. Dogs everywhere. A sea lion in the swimming pool at one point. A gift that proved impractical. Chickens. Ducks. The estate was part home, part zoo. The children multiplied rapidly. Ethel and Bobby would eventually have 11 children together. Kathleen, Joseph, Robert Jr., David, Mary Courtney, Michael, Mary Carey, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas, and Rory. The house was constantly filled with children running, shouting, playing. The atmosphere was completely different from Joe Sr.'s controlled compound. At Hyannis Port, competition was organized and purposeful. At Hickory Hill, it was joyful chaos. Children climbed trees, they fell into the pool, they played with animals. It was structured disorder rather than Joe's regimented training. Bobby embraced this environment. He'd always been the quiet, sensitive Kennedy, less naturally aggressive than Joe Jr. or John, more emotional than his father approved of. At Hickory Hill, away from Joe's judgment, he could create his own version of family life. The pool became famous not just for swimming, but for the parties. Political figures would visit, senators, cabinet members, journalists. At some point during the gathering, someone would get thrown into the pool fully clothed, often multiple people. It became Hickory Hill tradition. You weren't really welcomed until you'd been thrown in the pool. Ethel encouraged this wildness. She'd grown up wealthy, but less formally than the Kennedys. She was more spontaneous, more willing to embrace chaos. Where Rose Kennedy had managed 9 children with strict schedules and Catholic discipline, Ethel let her children be children. Rules existed, but were loosely enforced. The house itself reflected this. Toys everywhere, pet supplies, athletic equipment. It looked lived in rather than maintained as a showpiece. This was intentional. Hickory Hill wasn't trying to impress visitors with Kennedy elegance. It was a working family home where life happened loudly and messily. Bobby used Hickory Hill as his base as he rose in his brother's administration. When John became president in 1961, Bobby became Attorney General, despite being only 35 and having limited legal experience. The appointment was controversial, but Joe Sr. insisted family loyalty mattered more than conventional qualifications. As Attorney General, Bobby worked from the Justice Department but brought work home to Hickory Hill constantly. His study was filled with files. The phone rang at all hours. Staff came to the house for meetings. Political strategy sessions happened around the dinner table, with children eating simultaneously. This blending of work and family life was Kennedy tradition. Joe Sr. had done it at Hyannis Port. But Bobby's version was less formal, advisors stepping over toys, strategy discussions interrupted by children asking questions. The boundary between professional and personal was permeable. The estate also became gathering place for the extended Kennedy family. John would visit from the White House when he needed to talk privately with Bobby. Eunice, Patricia, Jean, Bobby's sisters, would bring their families. The compound at Hyannis Port was still the official family headquarters, but Hickory Hill became an alternative power center. This created some tension with Joe Sr. He'd built the Hyannis Port compound specifically so the family would stay together under his influence. Bobby establishing his own base in Virginia represented independence, not rebellion. Exactly. Bobby was loyal to family interests, but independence nonetheless. Joe Sr. had a stroke in December 1961. It left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. His control over the family loosened dramatically. Bobby, as John's closest advisor and Attorney General, became more autonomous. Hickory Hill's importance as a Kennedy power center increased. The property served Bobby's political purposes well. Journalists who visited saw energetic, attractive family life. Photos of Bobby playing with his children appeared in magazines. It projected vigor and warmth, the Kennedy image, but with more humanity and less of Joe Sr.'s cold calculation. Bobby's children were being raised differently than he'd been raised. Less pressure, more affection. Bobby had experienced Joe's harsh methods and chose differently for his own family. He still wanted his children to succeed, to serve, but he didn't create the pressure cooker environment he'd grown up in. Ethel was central to this. She managed the household chaos with remarkable tolerance. Children injured themselves constantly. Broken bones were common, with 11 children engaging in rough play. She took it in stride. Emergency room visits became routine. The family joke was that hospitals should give them a frequent visitor discount. The estate's grounds provided space for Kennedy athletic competitions, but with different tenor. At Hyannis Port, Joe Sr. had turned games into tests. Winners were celebrated. Losers were shamed. At Hickory Hill, Bobby played with his children, but emphasized fun over winning. He'd learned what his father's approach had cost. But Hickory Hill wasn't separate from Kennedy Dynasty. Bobby was still serving the family's political goals. He was still intensely competitive in his work. The estate was where he could be a slightly softer version of himself, where the warmth he couldn't show in public could emerge with his family. The house also reflected Bobby's evolution. He'd started as Joe Jr.'s younger brother, then John's younger brother, always in someone's shadow. But by the early 1960s, he was becoming his own figure. Attorney General, his brother's most trusted advisor, a Kennedy with his own identity and his own base of operations. Maya has found photographs comparing the 3 Kennedy properties from 1962. Hyannis Port, organized. Formal lawn games. Everything positioned for cameras. Joe Sr.'s creation. Competitive, controlled, purposeful. Palm Beach. Elegant. Formal. The marble and ebony still gleaming. Sophisticated retreat. Hickory Hill. Chaotic. A bicycle lying on the lawn. A dog running through the frame. Toys scattered across the porch. Warm. Filled with life in its messiest, noisiest forms. The 3 properties together showed the Kennedy family's range. Public image at Hyannis Port. Sophisticated retreat at Palm Beach. Real life at Hickory Hill. Each served different purposes. Each projected different aspects of Kennedy identity. By 1963, Hickory Hill was firmly established as Bobby's kingdom. 11 children and counting. Animals everywhere. Political power flowing through the house. A Kennedy Center that was different from what Joe Sr. had built, but still served the dynasty's needs. Bobby stood on the Hickory Hill grounds and watched his children play. He'd found a way to be Kennedy while being himself, to serve the family mission while creating space for love and warmth. The estate was his version of what his father had built at Hyannis Port. Similar purpose, different execution, better balance. What Bobby couldn't see was that Hickory Hill's joyful chaos was temporary. That tragedy was coming not just to Hyannis Port, but to his own home. That the estate he'd filled with children's laughter would know grief. That he'd created warmth, but couldn't protect it from what was approaching. In 1963, Hickory Hill was exactly what Bobby wanted it to be. A Kennedy estate that reflected his values rather than his father's. A place of joy, despite the political pressures. A home where family life could be genuine rather than performed. The darkness would come soon enough. But in 1963, Hickory Hill was light. Meanwhile, at Hyannis Port, a different transformation was happening. John Kennedy's election had turned the compound into the summer White House. The property Joe bought in 1928 to force his way into WASP society was now the most famous private residence in America. Peak Camelot was about to arrive. And so was Joe Sr.'s silence. January 20th, 1961. John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath as 35th President of the United States. At 43, he was the youngest elected president in American history. Irish Catholic, the grandson of Irish immigrants, the son of Joe Kennedy, who'd forced his way into WASP society 30 years earlier. Joe Sr. watched from the inaugural platform, vigorous, proud. His son was president. The dynasty was real. Everything he'd built toward for decades was happening. The presidency transformed Hyannis Port immediately. The compound that had been a private family estate became the summer White House. Secret Service agents flooded the property. Communications equipment was installed. A helipad was built on the lawn. Security fences went up. The casual access neighbors had once had vanished. The main house required modifications, secure phone lines to Washington, space for staff, areas for press briefings. The living room where the Kennedy children had once competed at dinner debates became a space where national security decisions were discussed. The other two houses on the compound, John's and the one designated for Robert, also needed security upgrades. The entire 6-acre property became a secured presidential facility during summer months. Local police coordinated with Secret Service. Coast Guard boats patrolled the waters offshore. The press corps established a presence in Hyannis. Hotels filled with journalists. Photographers waited outside the compound gates constantly. Every movement was documented. John sailing. Jackie and the children at the beach. Carolyn riding her pony. The Kennedys at play became national news. This was exactly what Joe Sr. had envisioned. The compound showcased Kennedy's success. Photos from Hyannis Port appeared in magazines worldwide. Life magazine, Look magazine, international publications. The images projected youth, vigor, beauty, optimism. American royalty in their summer palace. Jackie struggled with the exposure. She'd never liked the compound's chaos. Now privacy was completely gone. Cameras followed her everywhere. Her every outfit was analyzed. Her hairstyle was copied across America. She couldn't walk to the beach without photographers tracking her. She escaped when possible to her family's estate in Rhode Island, to their private home in Virginia, anywhere that offered relief from the constant Kennedy family presence and media attention. But summers at Hyannis Port were expected. She had to perform the role of President's wife at the summer White House. The Kennedy children adapted better. Caroline was born in 1957. John Jr., called John by the press, was born just weeks after the election in November 1960. They were young enough that the Secret Service presence seemed normal. Agents became part of their daily life. The compound's famous touch football games continued, but with added pressure. When the president played, it became news. Photos of Kennedy family football games appeared in newspapers. What had been private family competition became public spectacle, demonstrating Kennedy athleticism and competitive spirit. John used the compound strategically. When he needed to appear relaxed and confident, photos from Hyannis Port helped. When political tensions were high, images of the president sailing in Cape Cod reminded Americans of his youth and optimism. The property was a political asset. The sailing was genuine. John loved being on the water. It was one of the few activities where he could escape somewhat. Secret Service followed in another boat, but on the water he had space. The wind and waves drowned out the constant demands. It was the closest to privacy he could find. Visitors to the compound during the presidency ranged from family to world leaders. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan visited. Military advisors came for strategy sessions. Cabinet members flew in for meetings. What had been a family compound was now conducting national business. Rose Kennedy thrived during this period. Her son was president. Visitors came to pay respects to the president's mother. She gave interviews about raising successful children. She attended church, and everyone knew who she was. After decades of Joe being the dominant Kennedy, Rose had her own recognition. Then, in December 1961, Joe Sr. suffered a massive stroke while playing golf in Palm Beach. He collapsed on the course. When he recovered consciousness, he was partially paralyzed on his right side. His speech was severely impaired. He could understand everything, but could barely form words. The man who'd controlled his family through force of personality was suddenly unable to speak clearly. Maya has found the medical records from George Washington University Hospital. The diagnosis was brutal: right-sided hemiplegia, expressive aphasia, severe. Translation: Joe Kennedy could hear everything, could understand everything, but the words wouldn't come. He was brought back to Hyannis Port to recover. A wheelchair, a nurse, staff to help him with basic needs. He could watch what he'd built, but couldn't direct it anymore. His son was president. but Joe couldn't give orders or advice the way he'd always done. The stroke had silenced him. Robert became John's closest advisor after Joe's stroke. The brothers had always been close, but now Bobby filled the role their father couldn't. They'd talk for hours at the compound. Strategy, politics, decisions. The partnership that would define John's presidency was cemented during this period. Joe spent hours in his wheelchair on the porch observing. Staff would position him where he could see arrivals and departures. He'd watch his son, the president, conduct business. He'd see grandchildren playing. He could witness what he'd created but couldn't participate. The frustration was visible. Here's the architectural irony. Joe Kennedy had designed the Hyannis Port compound specifically to control his family, to keep them close, to direct their lives. Now the compound had become his prison. He couldn't leave without assistance. He couldn't speak to influence decisions. He couldn't move freely through the property he'd purchased to establish his dynasty. The machine he'd built was running without him, and he was trapped inside it, watching. The compound also became gathering place for the extended Kennedy family. Robert came frequently from Hickory Hill, Eunice, Patricia, Jean with their families. Ted, the youngest Kennedy son, now a senator himself, was a regular presence. The compound during the presidency was command center for the entire Kennedy clan. But the security and attention changed the atmosphere. The competitive games were performed for cameras now. The casual beach time was documented. The privacy that had allowed genuine family moments was gone. Everything was public. Everything was image management. Jackie's frustration grew. She'd married a senator. That was manageable. But being First Lady while spending summers at Hyannis Port surrounded by Kennedys and press was exhausting. She began taking separate vacations. Greece, Italy, anywhere she could escape the compound and the role. The strain showed. Jackie was photographed less frequently at Hyannis Port as the presidency continued. When she was there, her discomfort was sometimes visible. She loved her husband, but she'd never loved his family's way of life. The compound concentrated everything she found difficult about being a Kennedy. John noticed, but couldn't change much. The presidency required the image. Hyannis Port projected that image perfectly. The summer White House showed Americans a young, vital, optimistic first family. The compound was too valuable politically to abandon just because his wife was uncomfortable. The children provided some authenticity. Caroline and John playing on the beach weren't performing. They were genuinely children having summer fun. Those moments felt real in ways adult Kennedy activities increasingly didn't. The press loved photographing them because their joy was unforced. By summer 1963, the compound had been summer White House for 2.5 years. The routine was established. Security protocols were smooth. The press knew where to position themselves. Local businesses had adapted to hosting presidential operations. It had become normal. The famous rocking chair sat on the porch. John's back problems required special seating. The rocking chair became iconic. Photographs of the president rocking on the porch at Hyannis Port symbolized thoughtful leadership. John would sit there for hours reading briefing materials, making phone calls, conducting business. The compound represented the peak of Kennedy power, the presidency operating from the family estate. 3 generations of Kennedys gathering in the place Joe had purchased to establish their legitimacy. Everything he'd planned had come to fruition. Even if stroke had silenced him, he could watch it unfold. The foreign policy challenges were serious. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 had brought the world close to nuclear war. Vietnam was becoming complicated. Civil rights were creating domestic tension. But from Hyannis Port, with the sailing and the family and the sunshine, it could feel manageable. The summer of 1963 was beautiful. Long days, warm weather, the Kennedy children playing, John sailing, Rose attending church, Joe watching silently from his wheelchair, the extended family gathering. It felt like success, like permanence, like the dynasty was secured. Jackie took the children to the Cape in early September. Carolyn needed to start school. The family would return to Washington. The summer season at Hyannis Port was ending. The compound would quiet down. Next summer, they'd return and do it all again. No one knew that within months, everything would change. That the compound would transform from summer White House to site of national mourning. That the images of Kennedy happiness at Hyannis Port would become reminders of what was lost. That the peak moment was also the last moment before the fall. In September 1963, leaving Hyannis Port for Washington felt routine. The presidency would continue. The summers at the compound would continue. The dynasty Joe Sr. had built seemed unshakable. Joe sat in his wheelchair on the porch, watching his son leave. The president, his creation. He couldn't speak to say goodbye, couldn't give final advice, couldn't express what he felt seeing his son, the culmination of everything he'd built, walk to the helicopter. The words were trapped inside him, just like he was trapped inside the compound he'd designed. 2 months later, nothing would ever be the same. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. 3 gunshots. And the compound Joe Kennedy built to showcase triumph became the place where the family gathered to process the most public assassination in American history. The rooms that had witnessed Joe Jr.'s death, Kic's death, Rosemary's erasure, would now hold the grief for the president. The architecture of control was about to become the architecture of mourning. November 22, 1963. Rose Kennedy was at church. St. Francis Xavier in Hyannis. Friday morning Mass. She attended almost every day. It was part of her routine. Had been for decades. Faith had carried her through losing Joe Jr. and Kick. Faith would carry her through whatever came. She didn't know yet that something had come. Ted Kennedy was presiding over the Senate in Washington. Routine duty. A Friday afternoon. He was bored, going through the motions. An aide rushed in, whispered urgently. Ted's face changed. He left immediately, heading for the Senate cloakroom to make phone calls. At Hyannis Port, staff were cleaning the main house. The family wasn't there. The president was in Texas on a political trip. Jackie was with him. The compound was quiet, almost empty, just maintenance staff and Secret Service on reduced presence. The news came through televisions first. Bulletins interrupting regular programming. Shots fired in Dallas, the president hit. Rushed to hospital, condition unknown. The networks scrambled to confirm details. Confusion, contradicting reports. Then the confirmation. President Kennedy was dead. Ted reached Rose by phone. She'd returned from church, he told her. Their conversation was brief. Rose said she'd pray. What else could she do? Another son dead. The 3rd child she'd lost. She went back to church. Joe Sr. was in his room at the compound. The stroke had left him able to understand but barely able to speak. A nurse was with him. The television was on. He watched the coverage. Saw his son's body removed from the hospital. Saw Jackie in her pink suit stained with blood. He couldn't express what he felt. His face contorted. Tears came. He made sounds, but not words. The nurse held his hand. There was nothing to say anyway. His son, the president, the culmination of everything he'd built, shot in Dallas. The compound filled rapidly. Secret Service flooded back. Family members converged from different locations. Robert drove up from Washington with Ethel. Eunice came. Patricia came. Jean came. The Kennedy siblings gathering as they'd always done in crisis. Back to the compound. Back to where it started. The press surrounded the gates. Cameras. Reporters. But they kept distance. Even journalists knew this wasn't the time for questions. They filmed the arrivals, captured images of Kennedy's returning home in grief, but they didn't intrude further. Inside the main house, the family gathered. The living room, where they'd had so many dinners, where Joe Sr. had quizzed his children, where they debated and competed. Now they sat in silence. What was there to say? Robert was devastated. He and John had been closest partners in the presidency. They'd talked every day. Now John was gone, and Bobby was supposed to continue somehow, to be Attorney General under Johnson, to carry on. But how? Ted was the last brother, 29 years old, youngest of the Kennedy sons. He'd always been the baby, protected somewhat from the pressure Joe Sr. put on the older ones. Now he was the only Kennedy son left. That weight was crushing. Rose maintained composure through faith, God's will. She'd said it when Joe Jr. died, when Kick died. She'd say it now. God had called John home. She would accept it. Her grief was private, processed through prayer. She wouldn't break publicly. Joe Sr. couldn't maintain composure because he couldn't speak. The sounds he made were anguished. Staff tried to comfort him, but nothing helped. He'd built everything around his sons, political careers. 2 were dead, 1 remained. The dynasty he'd envisioned was collapsing. Jackie arrived 2 days later. She'd still been wearing the blood-stained pink suit when she returned to Washington, refusing to change. But by the time she reached Hyannis Port, she'd finally changed clothes. Black dress, veil. She brought Caroline and John. The children needed to be with family. The compound became the site where America's first family processed national tragedy privately. The funeral would be in Washington, the burial at Arlington. But before and after, the Kennedys were at Hyannis Port, where they'd always come in crisis. The empty bedroom in John's house on the compound was unbearable. Jackie couldn't stay there. Too many memories. The house where they'd spent summers, where the children had played, where John had worked as president. She stayed briefly, then left, taking the children. She couldn't be at the compound anymore. Maya has walked through those spaces. The photographs show what Jackie saw. John, on the porch, in the rocking chair. Sailing. Playing with Caroline and John. Images that had represented success now represented loss. The compound was filled with ghosts. The helipad that had been built for presidential arrivals sat empty. The communications equipment that had connected the summer White House to Washington was dismantled. The Secret Service presence diminished. The compound that had been center of presidential power was just a family estate again. But a family estate marked by death. Robert wandered the grounds, the dock where they'd sailed, the lawn where they'd played football. Everything reminded him of John. They'd grown up here together, competed here, learned here. Now John was gone, and Bobby was lost. The younger Kennedy generation was confused. Caroline was 5. She understood her father was gone, but not fully what that meant. John was 2 days short of his 3rd birthday, too young to understand. The cousins, Bobby's children from Hickory Hill, the other siblings' children, tried to make sense of it. Their Uncle Jack, who'd been president, was dead. The compound's meaning had shifted again. It had been training ground, then power center, then summer White House. Now it was memorial. Every room held memories of John. Every space echoed with his absence. The flag flew at half-mast. It would stay that way for weeks. The compound that had projected Kennedy optimism and vigor now projected grief. The images news crews captured from outside the gates showed a darkened, quiet place. The energy was gone. Visitors came to pay respects, politicians who'd worked with John, friends from the PT boat crew, people whose lives he'd touched. The family received them in the main house. Condolences were offered, stories were shared. But nothing helped. John was gone. Joe Sr. sat in his wheelchair and couldn't stop crying. The nurse would wipe his tears, but they kept coming. He'd lived to see his son become president. Now he'd lived to see that son murdered. The cruel mathematics of loss. He'd outlived 3 of his 9 children. The patriarch watching his dynasty die piece by piece. Rose tried to comfort him, but Joe was beyond comfort. The stroke had taken his ability to express himself. The assassination had taken his will to try. He sat in silence, broken only by sounds of grief he couldn't articulate. The compound would never be Summer White House again. That possibility died in Dallas. The house where a president had worked, where he'd hosted world leaders, where he'd made decisions affecting millions. It was just a house now. A house filled with sadness. Thanksgiving came days after the funeral. The family gathered at Hyannis Port as they always did for holidays. But the gathering was hollow. The empty chair where John should have sat was unavoidable. The children tried to play normally, the adults tried to function, neither succeeded. Robert gave thought to leaving politics. What was the point? His brother was dead. The dream was over. But family and advisors pressed him to continue. Kennedy legacy couldn't end. Someone had to carry on. Robert was the one who remained, but his heart wasn't in it. Not yet. December brought Joe Sr.'s birthday, 75 years old. There was no celebration. How could there be? His son had been murdered weeks earlier. Joe sat in the main house, unable to speak, watching his family try to process grief. The man who'd pushed them all so hard couldn't offer guidance now. He couldn't speak at all. The compound in winter was always quiet. But winter 1963 was different. Not just quiet, but heavy. The weight of loss hung over everything. The houses, the grounds, the beach, the dock. All of it marked by what had happened in Dallas. Palm Beach was no better. The family went there for winter as usual, but the Florida estate couldn't escape the shadow either. Joe Sr. sat by the pool in his wheelchair. The same pool where he'd held court for decades, where he'd made plans for his sons' political careers. Now mostly silent, except for his labored breathing and occasional sounds of grief. Jackie tried to build a new life. She bought a house in Georgetown, started planning the Kennedy Library, focused on her children. But she was marked forever by those moments in Dallas. The blood on her suit, the loss. Nothing would ever be normal again. The compound stood as reminder of what had been. The summer White House, the peak of Kennedy power, that moment in 1963 when everything seemed possible. When the young president sailed and played with his children and governed from his family estate, all gone, murdered in Dallas. The compound couldn't be that place anymore. It could only be where the Kennedys came to remember and to grieve. The rooms where Joe Jr. had lived before shipping out. The bedroom Rosemary had occupied before being erased. The spaces where Kick had laughed before choosing England. Now John's ghost joined them. The compound Joe Kennedy had built to showcase triumph had become exactly what he'd tried to prevent. A monument to loss. A place where empty chairs outnumbered the living. A house full of ghosts. But the Kennedy curse wasn't finished. 5 years later, in 1968, the compound would fill with grieving family again. Robert Kennedy, the last brother with political ambition, would follow the same path that had killed John. And Joe Sr., trapped in his wheelchair in the compound he'd built, would watch another son die. 2 assassinations in 5 years. And the dynasty would finally, completely, collapse. Robert Kennedy didn't want to run for president. Not really. The years after John's death had been difficult. He'd stayed on as Attorney General briefly under Johnson, but resigned in 1964. He ran for Senate from New York and won. But his heart wasn't in politics the way it had been when John was alive. Hickory Hill sustained him. Ethel. The children. By 1968, they had 10 children with another on the way. The chaos and warmth of his Virginia estate provided refuge from the darkness that had settled over the family after Dallas. But pressure built for him to run. Vietnam was tearing the country apart. Johnson wasn't seeking re-election. The Democratic nomination was open. Many saw Robert as the Kennedy who could finish what John started, who could heal the nation's wounds, who could restore Camelot. Robert resisted. He'd seen what the presidency cost: his brother murdered, his father destroyed by grief. But friends and advisors pushed. Eugene McCarthy was challenging Johnson from the left. If Robert didn't run, McCarthy might win the nomination. Kennedy's legacy would be sidelined. In March 1968, Robert announced his candidacy. The campaign was based from Hickory Hill when he was home. The estate that had been refuge became headquarters again. Staff, volunteers, press, the controlled chaos multiplied. Ethel was pregnant with their 11th child, due in December, but she campaigned with Robert anyway, bringing children along, making appearances. The image was powerful. The large Kennedy family, vibrant and engaged, offering hope after years of national turmoil. The campaign was grueling. Robert was energized by crowds but exhausted by the schedule. California was crucial. The primary there on June 4th would determine momentum. He needed to win California to have a real chance at the nomination. At Hyannis Port, Joe Sr. watched on television. He could barely move now. The stroke damage had worsened. He was confined to a chair or bed. Staff had to do everything for him. But he could watch. And what he saw was his remaining political son, putting himself in the same danger that had killed John. Rose prayed constantly. Another son in politics. Another target. She'd lost Joe Jr. in war. Lost John to an assassin. Now Robert was campaigning in a country that felt increasingly violent. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April. The nation was unstable. She feared for Robert, but couldn't tell him to quit. Kennedy men didn't quit. California primary night, June 4th, 1968. Robert won. Not overwhelmingly, but clearly. He spoke to supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Victory speech. Optimism about moving forward. The campaign was alive. He had momentum. He left the podium through the hotel kitchen. Shortcut to the press room. Aides surrounded him. Ethel was just behind. The kitchen was crowded. Hotel staff, reporters, campaign workers. Robert shook hands as he moved through. A man stepped forward. Sirhan, 24 years old, Palestinian. He'd written in his diary about hating Robert Kennedy for supporting Israel. He had a revolver. He fired at close range. The first shot hit Robert in the head behind the right ear. He fell immediately. 2 more shots hit him, back and armpit. Sirhan fired wildly after that. 5 other people were hit. Pandemonium. People wrestling Sirhan to the ground, screaming, blood. Ethel reached Robert. He was conscious briefly, spoke a few words, asked about others who'd been shot. Then he lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived. They worked on him in the kitchen, transported him to Good Samaritan Hospital. Surgeons operated for hours. At Hyannis Port, news reached the compound in the early morning hours, East Coast time. Another phone call, another Kennedy shot. Ted was notified first. He had to tell his parents, Rose and Joe, who couldn't respond except through tears and anguished sounds. The vigil lasted 26 hours. Robert never regained consciousness. Brain damage was too severe. On June 6, 1968, at 1:44 in the morning, Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. Ethel was pregnant with their 11th child. The compound filled with family again, 5 years after Dallas. Another gathering in grief. Another empty chair. Another Kennedy son dead. Ted was now the only surviving Kennedy brother. The weight of the dynasty fell entirely on him. Joe Sr. was beyond comfort. His nurse tried. His wife tried. Nothing penetrated. He'd lost a 3rd son, this one murdered like John, in a hotel kitchen, campaigning for president. The dynasty Joe had built was destroying itself. Everything he'd pushed his sons toward had led to death. Rose retreated to church. Hours of prayer, rosaries, Mass daily, sometimes multiple times. Faith was all she had left. 3 children dead, 1 institutionalized. Only 5 remained. The family she'd raised at Hyannis Port and Palm Beach was being decimated. Hickory Hill became a house of mourning. 10 children had lost their father. The 11th would be born never knowing him. The estate that had been so full of life and noise was suddenly quiet. The children were traumatized. Some would never fully recover. The funeral was in New York. Robert was buried at Arlington near John. Brothers reunited in death. The television coverage showed Ted Kennedy giving the eulogy. Last brother, speaking about the second brother to be assassinated. The impossibility of it was visible on his face. After the funeral, family returned to Hyannis Port. The compound was the gathering place where they'd always come, but it felt cursed now. 2 Kennedy brothers assassinated in 5 years. Both had used the compound. Both had been groomed there for politics. Both were dead. Joe Sr.'s health collapsed completely after Robert's death. The will to live was gone. He stopped eating properly, lost weight dramatically. The staff tried to keep him comfortable, but he was giving up. By November, 6 months after Robert died, Joe was fading. On November 18, 1968, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. died at Hyannis Port. He was 81 years old. He'd outlived 3 of his sons. He'd watched his dynasty crumble. The stroke had silenced him for the last 7 years. Now death silenced him permanently. The patriarch who'd bought the compound in 1928, who'd pushed his children relentlessly, who'd built a political dynasty through ambition and ruthlessness, who'd seen his son become president, and then seen that son murdered, who'd lost another son 5 years later. Gone. Rose was now the last of that generation. She'd married Joe in 1914. 54 years of marriage. 9 children, 3 dead, 1 institutionalized. She was 78 years old and alone with memories and faith. The compound felt emptier than ever. Joe Jr.'s room still preserved. John's house standing unused. Robert buried in Arlington. Joe Sr. gone. The energy that had driven everything for 40 years was extinguished. Ted tried to carry on. He was only 36 but felt ancient. The last Kennedy brother, expected to continue the dynasty, to be the surviving political Kennedy, to fulfill what Joe Jr., John, and Robert had started. But he was traumatized, drinking more, making poor decisions. Hickory Hill was eventually sold by Ethel. She couldn't live there anymore. Too many memories of Robert. The house where they'd raised 10 children together, where Robert had been happy despite political pressures. She needed to escape it. The estate that had represented Kennedy warmth and chaos became another property marked by tragedy. Maya has documented the final accounting. The 3 Kennedy estates, Hyannis Port, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill, all touched by death. Joe Jr.'s death announced at Hyannis Port. John's assassination mourned at both compounds. Robert's campaign based from Hickory Hill leading to his murder. Joe Sr. dying at Hyannis Port. The properties built to showcase success had become monuments to loss. Palm Beach especially felt haunted. Joe had suffered his stroke there, spent his final diminished years there. The elegant Mediterranean estate that had been winter headquarters was now just where the family went when Boston was too cold. But nobody wanted to be there. It reminded them of what they'd lost. By the end of 1968, the Kennedy family was shattered. The deaths, the trauma, the impossibility of continuing as they had. Ted was the only son left, and he was struggling. The younger generation was traumatized. The dynasty was broken. Rose remained at Hyannis Port. She'd live there for decades more. watching grandchildren grow, attending Mass, praying for her dead children. The compound became her domain, the place she'd managed for 40 years, now managing it alone. The houses stood, the grounds remained, but the meaning had changed completely. From training ground to power center to memorial. 3 Kennedy sons had been raised there. 2 were murdered. The 3rd carried impossible weight. The compound couldn't escape what it had witnessed. But Ted Kennedy, the last brother, still had one more chapter to write. One more tragedy that would forever answer the question of whether a Kennedy could ever escape the weight of the dynasty Joe had built. July 1969. Chappaquiddick Island. A car. A bridge. A young woman. And the final proof that the compound's curse extended even to the survivors. Ted Kennedy was the survivor, the youngest son, the one who wasn't supposed to carry the dynasty. Joe Jr. was the heir. John was the backup. Robert was the conscience. Ted was just the baby brother who'd go into politics because that's what Kennedys did. Now he was the only one left. 37 years old in 1969, senator from Massachusetts like John had been. Expected to run for president eventually. Expected to fulfill what his 3 dead brothers couldn't. The weight was crushing. He drank more than he should. Made questionable decisions, had relationships outside his marriage that everyone knew about. But he was a Kennedy, the last Kennedy son. People forgave him, or at least looked away. The family had suffered enough tragedy. Let Ted have his flaws. July 18th, 1969, a year after Robert's death. Ted was on Martha's Vineyard, a short distance from Hyannis Port. There was a party on Chappaquiddick Island, a reunion for women who'd worked on Robert's presidential campaign. Ted attended with his cousin Joe Gargan and friend Paul Markham. One of the women there was Mary Jo Kopechne. 28 years old, she'd been devoted to Robert's campaign. She'd been devastated by his death. She'd worked in Ted's Senate office after. She was smart, dedicated, idealistic. She believed in the Kennedys despite everything. Around 11:30 that night, Ted said he was leaving. He'd drive Mary Jo back to her hotel. She needed to catch a ferry in the morning. The party continued without them. Nobody thought much of it. Senator Kennedy giving a staff member a ride. Nothing unusual. Ted was driving his mother's Oldsmobile. Dark night. Unfamiliar roads. He turned onto Dyke Road, leading to a small bridge. The bridge was narrow, wooden. No guardrails. Used mainly during daytime by locals who knew it was there. What happened next has been disputed for over 50 years. Ted's account, given later, was that he missed the turn. The car went off the bridge into Poocha Pond. The car flipped, filled with water, sank. Ted escaped. He said he dove repeatedly trying to reach Mary Jo. The water was dark, cold, the current strong. He couldn't find her. He couldn't get her out. Eventually, he gave up. He swam to shore, exhausted, in shock. Mary Jo was trapped in the car. As water filled the vehicle, she likely found an air pocket. Survived for some time, breathing in that small space, waiting for rescue that never came. Eventually, the air ran out. She drowned. Ted didn't call police immediately. This is the part that destroyed him. He walked back to the party cottage, got Joe Gargan and Paul Markham. They returned to the bridge, tried to reach the car, couldn't. It was underwater, invisible in the dark. Gargan and Markham urged Ted to report the accident immediately. He refused. He said he'd take care of it. He dove into the channel and swam across to Edgartown where he was staying. Left his cousin and friend behind. Went to his hotel room. Changed clothes, appeared in the lobby briefly, establishing he'd been there, then went to his room. He didn't call police, didn't call rescue services, didn't do anything. For 9 hours, Mary Jo's body was in that submerged car, while Ted Kennedy slept in a hotel room. The next morning, 2 fishermen found the car upside down in the water. They called police. Divers recovered Mary Jo's body. The investigation began. Where was the driver? Who owned the car? Ted finally went to the Edgartown police station around 10 o'clock in the morning, nearly 10 hours after the accident. He reported what had happened. He was driving, he'd gone off the bridge, the passenger drowned. He claimed he'd been in shock, confused, disoriented. The story immediately had problems. The timeline didn't make sense. Why the 9-hour delay? Why had he left the scene? Why hadn't he called for help when there might have been time to save her? Why had he gone back to his hotel and slept while Mary Jo was dying or dead in the water? The Kennedy family machine activated immediately. Lawyers flew to Martha's Vineyard. Damage control began. Ted would plead guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. A week later, he appeared in court, received a 2-month suspended sentence and a year's probation. The legal consequences were minimal, but the political consequences were devastating. A Kennedy had left a woman to die, had delayed reporting for 9 hours, had protected himself while she drowned. This was unforgivable. At Hyannis Port, the family gathered. Rose was horrified, not just by what happened, but by how it looked. Another Kennedy scandal. Her last surviving son disgraced. She prayed, but this time prayer didn't provide the comfort it usually did. The compound was surrounded by press again, not covering success or even mourning tragedy, covering scandal. The gates closed. The family tried to wait it out, but this wouldn't blow over quickly. The questions never stopped. Books were written analyzing the accident. Investigations continued for years. The 9-hour delay remained unexplained satisfactorily. Mary Jo's parents, Joseph and Gwen Kopechny, buried their daughter. They accepted a settlement from Ted's insurance. They didn't push for criminal charges. But their grief was compounded by questions. What really happened to their daughter? Why did no one try to save her? Why did Ted Kennedy leave her there? Ted's presidential ambitions died in Pucha Pond along with Mary Jo. He'd been expected to run in 1972. He was a Kennedy, last surviving brother. He'd have won the nomination easily, probably won the presidency. The dynasty would have continued. But Chappaquiddick made that impossible. A man who'd left a woman to die couldn't be president. Americans could forgive many things. They'd forgiven Kennedy infidelities. They'd forgiven questionable business dealings. But leaving someone to drown while you went to your hotel room, that was unforgivable. Ted continued as senator. He'd served Massachusetts for decades more, become one of the most effective legislators in Senate history. But he'd never be president. That possibility died on July 18, 1969. But Compound became associated with scandal now, not just tragedy. The properties Joe Sr. had built to showcase Kennedy's success were marked by death and disgrace. 2 brothers assassinated. The 3rd brother involved in a young woman's drowning death. The dynasty was over. Not officially. Kennedys would remain in politics for generations. But the dream Joe Sr. had built, the vision of Kennedy men dominating American politics through excellence and achievement, that was finished. Maya closes the archival boxes, the last files, the final photographs. She's walked through every room of this story. The preserved bedrooms, the empty chairs, the locked doors. And here's what the architecture revealed. Joe Kennedy designed a Hyannis Port compound to control his family, to train them, to mold them into winners. But buildings don't just house people. They reveal people. The compound showed what Joe valued: competition over compassion, image over humanity, dynasty over individual lives. Rosemary's room marked as storage after she was erased. Joe Jr.'s bedroom sealed and preserved while the pressure transferred to John. The dining table with empty chairs multiplying year by year. Hyannis Port, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill. 3 estates built to project power and success. By 1969, they represented tragedy and scandal. The curse, if you believed in such things, was complete. But it wasn't a curse. It was cause and effect. Joe Kennedy built a machine designed to produce presidents. He fed his children into that machine, and the machine destroyed them. Architecture doesn't lie. The empty rooms tell the truth. The preserved spaces record the cost. Mary Jo Kopechne is buried in Pennsylvania. Her gravestone includes her dates and her devotion to Robert Kennedy's campaign. She believed in the Kennedys. That belief killed her. She drowned in Pucha Pond while Ted Kennedy slept. The compound at Hyannis Port still stands. Rose lived there until her death in 1995. Ted visited until his death in 2009. The rooms that witnessed Joe Jr.'s training, John's reluctant inheritance, Robert's grief, Ted's crushing weight. All of it preserved in wood and stone. The Kennedy estates aren't just houses, they're monuments. Not to triumph, to what triumph costs when you're willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the dark stories these estates conceal, subscribe for more examinations of America's most notorious family compounds. Because buildings remember what people try to forget, and architecture always tells the truth.